last year. I can remember, more than a decade ago, having a meeting with Kelder Group, who ran Yorkshire Water at the time, and they were borrowing money at a higher rate of interest than I could borrow money as a simple peasant farmer in North Yorkshire.
I can't speak for, obviously, that situation, but what I can say is 97% of our debt is fixed in real or nominal terms. That's part of a prudent strategy to ensure that we manage our interest costs. So we, as I said, our total cash interest cost last year was only £235 million. That reflects a conscious policy to ensure that we do hedge the risk of interest rates, amongst other things, and inflation. But
half your debt is linked to inflation, so that's you're more like the person with a mortgage who finds that the renewals come up than somebody who's fixed it in for 5 years at the sort of rates you could get last year and for the previous 7 or 8 years.
Indeed, but like all companies, we ultimately have to borrow money at the prevailing rate when we borrow new money, and that will reflect the Bank of England's interest rates at the time.
Okay, thanks. Alan Brown.
Thanks, Chair. This for Alistair. What's Thames Water's debt and how much has been paid in dividends since privatisation?
So, current level of net debt is £14 billion. That compares to a regulated capital value, the value of the business, of £19 billion, which gives you the 77% gearing rate. In total, dividends that left the company since privatisation is about £3 billion. If you compare that to how much equity investment that has been already put into the business and or will be put into the business as part of this equity support package, that's about £4 billion. So in essence, the current set of shareholders who haven't taken any dividend at all will be committing best part of £4 billion of equity to this business.
I've seen much higher figures in dividends. Is that $4 billion robust? But even then, that's $4 billion that's paid to shareholders that could have been invested elsewhere, surely.
Indeed, but we're investing almost a record £1.8 billion this last year. We will maintain those record levels of investment going forward. And in fact, we fully expect investment levels to have to increase in the next price control as we seek to improve asset resilience, but also improve environmental
Is that dividends
performance.
to external shareholders or to actual the sort of core investors in the company we're talking about?
That was total dividends so last year, for example, we paid £45 million to service debt at the ultimate holding company. But to be absolutely clear, our current shareholders, have taken no dividends since 2017.
By the way, in your figures, roughly 33% of the debt equates to dividends.
Sorry?
Roughly 33% of your debt is equivalent to dividends that's been paid out.
In that simple maths, absolutely, that's correct.
Okay. Can I ask about Thames Tideway? How's that funded?
That's funded by an entirely different regulatory price control. It's not funded by Thames. It's a different company that's independent of Thames.
And does Thames investors get any returns from Thames Tideway?
Not directly.
Okay. It's also underpinned by the regulatory asset-based model. How much cheaper has that made that? Because that's obviously underpinned by the UK-wide exchequer.
So is your question?
Well, Thames Tideway, the infrastructure is funded under a regulated asset-based model, which is risk sharing with the UK taxpayer. How much of a benefit does that bring?
That, as I understand it, helped reduce the cost of funding of that project.
How much?
I don't know. You'd have to ask Tideway.
What was the original estimate for Thames Tideway, and what's the current construction estimate?
As I say, I'm not the best person to ask because it's an entirely independent company.
Okay. I don't think I'm getting any more there, Chair. So.
Thank you very much. If we could just move on to Philip Dunn, who chairs the Environmental Audit Select Committee, who's been very involved in water quality, particularly in our rivers.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to touch a bit on some of the regulatory challenges that the company faces. I think, Mr. Cochrane, you became Finance Director after the record fine of £20 million in 2017 for sewage leakage, and then the repayment to customers of £120 million for water supply leakage problems. But you were in post last week when the company was again fined over £3 million by Ofwat for deliberately misleading Ofwat, according to the citation. Is there a culture of ignoring regulatory requirements in the company?
Shall I pick that up? Would you mind? Yes, so...
Yes, there is a culture. Yes, you're going to answer the question.
Yes, I'm going to pick up your question and answer it. So you're right. So last week we had the decision from the judge in the Crawley prosecution case. That case dates back to 2017. So it is rather historical in nature. There is no doubt that we caused a serious pollution incident in the Crawley stream. We've apologised unreservedly for that. The judge in that case did find that we had deliberately misled the Environment Agency. I have been through the case file, I've read everything, I don't see that, but obviously we completely respect the judge's decision. In terms of your point on culture, I think one of the things that we've done over the past couple of years, particularly under Sarah's leadership, has been to really change the values and behaviours and the culture across the company. I think historically we were a company in which bad news travelled upwards too slowly. I think people were afraid actually to say how things really were on the ground. And I think that's one of the things that we've achieved actually over the past couple of years, has really been to turn that around, and it's really helping us to be honest actually within the company about the challenges that we face so that we can really address them and make improvements.
Are you included within the companies being investigated by Ofwat and the Environment Agency for breaches of licensing for sewage discharges?
We are.
And how many cases are being investigated at the moment?
Well, at the moment we've got two large investigations. So we've got one being conducted by the Environment Agency in relation to compliance with flow-to-full treatment, and then we've got another one being conducted by Ofwat on the same issue, and I believe Ofwat is also contemplating whether we're in breach of Section 94 of the Water Industry Act, which is obviously the provision of effectual drainage. They are considering multiple instances under that broad heading, but there are just those two investigations.
So Ofwat have indicated with the Environment Agency they're looking at over 2,000 breaches across the industry. Can you indicate to the committee what proportion of that, if you haven't got a specific number?
Yeah, I don't have the specific number with me. I mean, I certainly think that Thames would represent a large proportion of that. We have been very open and transparent about the extent to which we are discharging untreated sewage into rivers. We've also said that that is unacceptable, and we've been fully cooperative with the investigations that are being run both by Ofwat and the Environment Agency.
Final question from me, Chair. The government have announced today that they're removing the cap on fines for breaches of licence permits. Have you made any assessment yet of what you think that might mean for Thames Water in the event that these investigations lead to fines?
We haven't assessed the impact of that particular change, no. I mean, the one thing that I would say, though, is that although I can understand why the government is doing what it's doing, we are committed to becoming more compliant with this legislation. We're committed to delivering better against the expectations of the public in respect of river health. And almost regardless of the level of financial penalties, we would stay committed to those goals because it's simply the right thing to do, and that's what the public expect.
This is a culture change that we can look to for the future, which Alistair, I assume you endorse.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that respecting our environmental obligations, respecting our obligations regarding drinking water, these are the fundamental bedrocks on which a successful company culture is based. And actually, I think one of the important sort of contributory factors is the culture of the people at the coalface. It's probably mixing my metaphors. And I think when you I've started to talk to people on the ground, they are very committed to customer service. And they are the best advocates for the business. We must empower them and let them do their business going forward.
Ask the witnesses to speak up.
Thank you, Chair.
Could the witnesses speak up a little, please? I'm being asked. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just, I think, going back to what you said about it was a leak near Gatwick, wasn't it, where lots of fish were killed. And I've read some of the, and it was a genuine either mistake or a technical fault that caused the problem. The problem was the cover-up afterwards. And I think the judge, Christine Lang, KC, said she believed, and I quote, there had been a deliberate attempt to mislead the Environment Agency by omitting water readings and submitting a report to the regulator denying responsibility. Are you saying you don't agree with that? You said it was, what was it, accidental? It wasn't deliberate, it was accidental that the misleading readings were given and the responsibility was denied?
Let me recap, and first let me say I absolutely accept the judge's decision. There's no equivocation with the judge's findings, but what happened in that case was that we had two pumps working to pump sewage in the sewage treatment works, and one of them started to work constantly to pump sewage directly from where the sewage came in.
Into the stormwater tank. We're not denying that there was a technical fault. It was the cover-up, which I think the judge was drawing attention to, and the attempt to mislead Ofwat about what actually had happened.
Yeah, I mean, to clarify, it was the Environment Agency rather than Ofwat, but the point still stands. So what happened was we actually conducted two separate investigations into what happened following this malfunction of a pump. One of those investigations concluded that there were multiple factors that could have contributed to the pollution incident, and it wasn't clear that it was our error. And a different investigation conducted by a different team concluded that it was in fact to do with an error that was made by Thames Water not to sort out the malfunctioning pump. Those two investigations happened in parallel. They were conducted by separate teams. Those teams did not talk to each other. When we were asked to submit our investigation to the Environment Agency, the investigation that got submitted was in fact the one that had said that it wasn't our fault. In fact, what should have happened is that we should have sent both of those investigations and all the underlying data to the Environment Agency, which in due course we then did.
Right.
But of course it transpired that what appeared, if you were looking at this from the Environment Agency's point of view, is that Thames Water had said that it wasn't its fault when it knew that it was its fault. And I can see how that comes across. I can absolutely see how that comes across. I think it was an error on our part rather than a deliberate intention to mislead, but I completely respect the findings of the judge.
Adrian.
I just add one coda to that. It's very early days for me. I've been in the chair for 2 days. But I've got a lot of experience of dealing with other utilities. And I think the change...
Could you speak up, please?
I'm sorry. The change that needs to occur within Thames is to treat all our regulators as partners. We must have an open book basis with the regulators. We must treat them as people who have the interests of the industry and actually of Thames's customers at heart, and just help them by being very transparent in what we do. That is the tone, I think, that we need to set from the top.
Okay, thank you. Barry Gardner.
Yes, Mr. Cochrane, you've painted to my colleagues a very good picture of the state of the company at the moment. But in May of this year, JP Morgan's report said it had poor financial performance. You've been the finance director, finance officer for since 2021. Weak operational performance, a stretched balance sheet. It talked about the enforcement cases coming from Ofwat and portended stricter Ofwat dividend policy coming in the future. 151 of your staff you've now chosen to make redundant. That was on the 20th of June, just a month after that report. Are they paying the price for your failure?
I think we have been very clear, indeed on Monday when we released our results, that our operational and financial performance wasn't where it needed to be. We've been very transparent about that. We know we need to improve performance for our customers.
You haven't been transparent about that for the past 2 years, have you, since you've been financial director? Let's look at the figure that you discussed with my colleague earlier, £14 billion of debt. I think actually note 18 of your account shows that your borrowings are 15.7 billion. How does that reconcile with the 14 billion that you were talking about earlier?
So 14 billion, just to be absolutely clear, is our statutory measure of net debt.
Net debt.
For covenant calculation purposes, which is what we report in terms of gearing, it's 14.7 billion, and that takes account of what is called debt accretion, the additional costs for hedging, inflation, and other risks.
That was 14.5, isn't it?
14.7.
I thought 14.5 takes the form of your whole business securitization, a structure that you've used to borrow against your highly regulated assets.
So a net debt on a covenant basis is 14.7. That, as I say, compares to get to the 77% of gearing, which is the lowest level of gearing in the last decade that we announced this week.
Sorry, the lowest level of gearing in the last decade that you've announced, but the second highest in the sector.
Indeed, but...
Yeah, indeed. And the Ofwat, when you were regulating Ofwat, or controlling Ofwat, Ms. Ross, I thought you said that the ratio should be 60%. Not 77, not 80. Is that not the case? You said it should be 60%?
Well, the 60% gearing that we were using when I was at Ofwat, and in fact Ofwat's been using right up until the last price review, is the notional level of gearing that Ofwat uses to input into the formula that it uses to determine the weighted average cost of capital.
So did you recommend 60%? Yes, you did, didn't you?
No, we were using a 60% assumption for the purposes of calculating the weighted average cost of capital in a price control.
So you weren't concerned at all that at that period the company had over 80%?
Our view at the time, and I will fully acknowledge that views have moved on, but our view at the time was that a company's choice of capital structure was a matter for the company itself and that the shareholders bore the risk of that. Now, obviously, views have moved on since then. That was the view at the time.
Right. So now that the views have moved on, what discussions have you had with the government on the potential nationalisation of your company?
None.
None. Why do you think it's being talked about in the press so freely?
Well, I can say that over the last couple of weeks I've read a lot in the press. Some of that was rather more outlandish than perhaps we would have liked. I think.
Well, one of the things that may be outlandish, maybe Mr. Cochrane can come to this, is the way in which you structured, what was it, £560 million of debt, just in the case that the government should have to take over the company. Do you want to comment on that, Mr. Cochrane?
Which debt are you referring to?
This is the amount of money that would be payable from your debt should the government would have to pay £560 million off to your debtors.
I don't recognise that figure, but...
I think what Barry's referring to is when Mr Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party and there were manifesto commitments to...
I think I'll say it in my own words, Chair. Thank you very much. Okay? There was talk about the nationalisation of the water company at that time, but actually since then public opinion's moved on. Public opinion has actually gone from 79% of people opposed to nationalisation now to 83% because of the way in which your companies have been failing to meet the public's expectations. So nationalisation seems to be a pretty popular thing amongst the public, and maybe that's been referenced in the press. But my question is about the way in which you included a clause in a previous debt issue that would require the government to immediately pay off around £500 million of debt in the case of nationalisation. You don't recognise that clause?
Don't recognise that clause, no.
Okay, in that case, perhaps you could... Sorry, Sir Adrian, you seem to want to come in there.
I was going to address the question of nationalisation very briefly.
Okay, if we can just finish off with Mr Cochrane first. If you could write to us to tell us, in fact, was such a clause included in a previous debt issue? If it was, why was it? And what would the implications of that have been for the government? Thank you very much.
We'll do that.
Yes, Sir Adrian.
I was going to address your question on nationalisation. If you go back to the very dawn of the private ownership of these utilities, the rationale was to empower the utilities to borrow privately, to use private sector capabilities to drive performance through the operation of the utilities. We say that we have much more to do in that area. But I think the key thing is remove from the Treasury the burden of funding the improvements to the water sector that we're now managing privately. And that was the driver of privatisation.
But the problem, Sir Adrian, has been that actually, although there has been substantial investment in the infrastructure since privatisation, I absolutely agree with you on that, it hasn't been enough, has it? And that's exactly the point of my colleague Mr Dunn's questions to your colleague earlier.
And indeed, we've got to increase the flow of that investment. That's what our refinancing package is aiming to do.
What your structure, the structure of the company, not when you were there, Sir Adrian, but what the structure of the company allowed was for an Australian bank to actually leverage the fact that you're a regulated asset to extract money out. Did it not?
Yes, I think that there was a flow of dividends from the company under previous ownership. It's, for us, quite a long time ago, Mr Gardner. I think it reflected slightly different.
It reflects the state of the company now, doesn't it, Sir Adrian?
It reflects, I think, the state of what the markets were and the practices at that time. I can't.
Those practices are still going on, aren't they?
I can't.
Macquarie's doing the same in other regulated industries. And actually, you yourself, I believe, are on one of Macquarie's companies, Cadent, and actually Catherine Ross is on British Gas Transmission, aren't you?
National Gas Transmission.
National Gas Transition, which are both Macquarie companies.
No,
So it seems that there's a very cosy arrangement here.
I have to correct you, Mr Gardner. They are not Macquarie companies. They have a range of international investors in them, including, in my case, Chinese and Qatari investors. They're all very responsible investors. They're all seeking to improve the performance of the companies. That is the case here. It was probably the case when Macquarie owned a major stake in the company. I can't answer to that myself. But this was ancient history, relatively speaking, ancient history for us, because Macquarie exited in 2017.
Well, you and I have a different definition of ancient, Sir Adrian. Thank you very much.
Reflects my age.
Thank you. Rosie, I think you wanted to come with the supplementary on that question.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just following on from Barry Gardner's question, 278,418 people have now signed the petition to bring water companies back into national ownership, and I helped some of my constituents deliver that to Downing Street around Christmas last year because it was started by a group in my constituency. Just leaving aside, the idea that you don't think that that would work, because obviously you don't, do you understand why the public would like to see our government or whoever being responsible for the water company so that everything's transparent? It's not as though we can shop around as customers. It's a vital utility. We don't know who all these investors are from foreign companies that own our utilities. Can you understand, any of you or all of you, why the public want transparency so we don't have to do inquiries like this?
I think that public ownership seems to be the answer to many questions. I think when you conduct a real evaluation, I think private ownership is still the way forward. I mean, that's a personal belief. I've been associated with private sector operations all my life. I can understand the frustration of customers. We want to see improvements. We would love to be able to deliver all those improvements overnight, but it will take time. We will try very hard to bring the customers with us. Our frontline employees serve customers every day. They're very much in touch with everything that happens on the ground. We also need to be in touch with things that happen on the ground. And we've got to improve our standing with customers. We're absolutely agreed on that. But I think the way is continuing the private sector model, not reverting to the public sector. That will be my instinct.
Okay, I mean, on the ground in Whitstable, in my constituency, there's lots of poo and sewage, so it'd be nice to improve that. Anyone else want to come in on that?
I mean, the only thing I would add is there is obviously a perfectly reasonable national policy debate about ownership models. I think that's perfectly legitimate. That's absolutely normal in a democracy. Our job at Thames, and this is what Adrian was talking about, is to keep the taps flowing and the loos flushing and to improve our performance under whatever model the government of the day decides, and that's what we'll keep focusing on.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Rosie. Derek Thomas.
Thank you, Chairman. Catherine, we just heard your Chairman talk about wanting a closer relationship or partnership, was the word used, between Thames Water and Ofwat. You were a previous Chief Executive. So does the relationship that is aspired to, this partnership? And does the trend of Ofwat staff seeking high paid positions in industry affect the ability to regulate water companies?
Yeah, so the first thing, just to be really clear on, which I'm sure you know, is I left Ofwat in January 2018. I went to work for BT for 3.5 years before I then applied for the role at Thames Water. So there was quite a gap between me leaving Ofwat and joining Thames, which is quite important. I mean, personally, I think that there is an important role for better understanding between companies and the regulator about what each is trying to achieve and about how the regime works. I mean, I'm immensely proud of my time at Ofwat. I think Ofwat people do an incredibly difficult job every day. They're very passionate about the water sector and wanting to deliver for customers. And I think for me to come into a water company, and a water company which is facing very considerable challenges and a massive turnaround, but bringing that understanding of what the regulator is trying to achieve, which is actually very much in common with what we're trying to do at Thames, is helpful. And I think that mutual understanding is beneficial.
Thank you for that. So while you were Chief Exec, you delivered a strategy on building trust and confidence in water services. Has that been delivered?
It's a work in progress.
And so I'm a West Cornwall MP, so you might understand why I asked that question. What was your view on Macquarie's approach to Thames Water while you were CEO of Ofwat between 2013? We've covered it briefly, but in terms of their relationship and the way they built up debt, was that a concern when you were Chief Exec?
Yeah, so let me just sort of go back to that time, which, as I said before, does feel like quite a different world, actually. I think things have moved on a lot. So when I joined Ofwat, as I said before, the zeitgeist at the time was very much that decisions around capital structure were a matter for companies and their investors were on risk for that. And that as a regulator, we would keep a weather eye on things and we would be ready to act, but only when acting was really necessary. So things like the requirement in licenses to maintain an investment-grade credit rating was really important. But beyond that, if a company chose to gear up, essentially its equity was bearing more risk, and that was a choice for its equity. Now, I think, even as I was sort of leaving Ofwat sort of 2017-ish, and then after I left in 2018, I think views moved on quite considerably, and as you've seen in more recent years, Ofwat's taken a keener interest in what it calls financial resilience, which is a broader concept, and then as part of that in capital structures that then culminated in more recent licence modifications.
So given that financial resistance and the extraordinary pressure on Thames Water today, do you expect or intend to increase customer bills in the near future?
Well, in the near future, not. So we're currently in the current price control settlement that was established by Ofwat in 2019. So the Ofwat can't reopen that, and so those price limits will hold until 2024. So we remain restricted by the PR19.
That's just next year, though.
Until, exactly. Now, beyond then, and I think we've already talked about this, there is no doubt, and Thames is not alone here, there is no doubt that there is a substantial need for more investment in the sector as a whole, including in Thames. And we've said repeatedly we have an ageing asset base. We have assets that aren't as resilient as our customers and the environment would expect them to be. We also have a lot of new infrastructure that we need to invest in to meet the challenges of climate change adaptation and population change. And so that will need to be funded. And it is an unfortunate truth that the only source of ultimate funding for that in the current model is the customer. Now, the really important thing is that we as a water company are as efficient as we possibly can be so that a customer does not pay £1 more than they need to. But it's also important, our previous conversation, that we can access capital markets so that we can finance that investment and smooth the cost over decades rather than basically having to recover all of that cost in, let's say, a 5-year period, in which case the bills will be substantially higher.
So, Adrian, then, hearing all that and understanding that at the moment, if you were to put prices up, the customers would feel they're just paying for the failure of Thames Water, potentially. The work you need to do between now and next year, how are you going to approach that to restore trust so that when people's bills increase potentially, that actually they recognise it's to pay for the service they receive, not the way the companies run?
I think there are 2 elements to this. We must deliver on our promises, and we must be much better at communicating with customers. It's a long, hard road, but that's what we will have to do.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed. Can we ask Darren to come in? He's chair of the Business and Energy Committee, so we're pleased to have you as our guest.
Thank you, Sir Robert. Good morning, everybody. Catherine Ross, in 2014, as the Chief Executive of the Water Regulator, you signed off the business plans for the water companies, didn't you?
I did.
And you just said that at that time you thought it was okay for those companies to increase their debts because it was their risk. Is that right?
Yep.
What would have happened at that time if any of the water companies went bankrupt?
Oh gosh, right. So let's just take a step back.
And if you could ask my question, if a company during the time when you were CEO went bust, what would have happened?
Yeah. So what would have happened in the event of a bankruptcy or an insolvency is that the special administration regime that's set out in the legislative framework would kick in. That is a decision for the Secretary of State. I mean, when I was at Ofwat, our expectation would have been that we would advise on that, but it would have been a decision, as I think it still is, for the Secretary of State.
In plain English, that means that it would have had to be nationalised and taxpayers would have had to pick up the bill. That's right, isn't it?
Not necessarily.
Well, a special administrative regime, either you sell the business to someone else as a going concern, as we've seen in the failure of the energy market, or the government has to pick up the bill, as it had to do with Bulb Energy. So ultimately, the taxpayer would have been on the hook, wouldn't they?
Well, in the event that the company couldn't be sold as a going concern, yes, there would be some liabilities that would have to be met, and they could be met by the taxpayer, or they could be passed on to future customers, depending on the regulatory regime at the time.
Right. We're here today because Thames Water, which you now run, is in a position where the government is having to plan to renationalise you because of a failure of your finances. But you signed off as the Chief Executive of the regulator in 2014 for Macquarie to ramp up the debt from £3 billion to £10 billion, whilst taking out nearly £3 billion in dividends, often paying dividends higher than the profits the company made in particular years. The reason we're in this position, and the reason that taxpayers are now potentially on the hook for billions and billions of pounds of national borrowing, is because you, as the Chief Executive of the regulator, and the regulator failed in delivering your statutory duties. Do you want to apologise to the public, Ms Ross?
Well, I don't accept that characterisation of Ofwat's price control in 2014. The other thing I would say as well is special administration is obviously a matter for the government, but special administration is very much a nuclear option. There is a very, very high bar on the government deciding to put a company into special administration. And one of those triggers would be insolvency, and the other one would be perhaps a persistent and severe breach of our licence. Now, we are not close to either of those two triggers, and you heard our CFO talking a little while ago about the fact that we have £4.4 billion of liquidity. We are a long way off that insolvency trigger, and I think a long way off the conditions for special administration being met.
Okay. Could I just add something?
When I'm ready, Sir Adrian, sorry, forgive me. So, Ms Ross, you just said in the 2014 price review you didn't accept that characterisation, but you've just admitted to the committee that you signed off the business plans that allowed Macquarie to increase the debt, which has got Thames Water into the position it's been in. The regulator facilitated this problem, didn't it? Let
me clarify. So, in 2014, the Ofwat board, not just the Ofwat chief executive, issued a set of final determinations. That is correct. What those final determinations actually did was set out what the company needed to deliver for its customers and the environment, and also the amount of money that they could recover from their customers to do that. That is all they did. And then, of course, the incentive framework that Ofwat puts around that determines the amount of money that the company actually makes. Now, Ofwat policy at that time, which has moved on, but Ofwat policy at that time was that if a company made a profit under that regulatory regime, it was up to the company to decide what it did with that. So if it chose to pay that profit out of the company in distributions, it was free to do that.
Ms Ross, let me ask the question in a different way. Two of the statutory obligations of Ofwat, the water regulator, when it was set up, was one, to protect the interests of customers, and two, to make sure the privatised water companies could finance themselves. On both of those measures, are you seriously telling the committee today that you, as the Chief Executive of the regulator at the time, succeeded in delivering those statutory obligations in the context that you're before the committee today? Are you really saying that was a success?
I think at the time, when I was at Ofwat, and I believe it to be true today, everybody at Ofwat takes their statutory duties incredibly seriously.
Did you perform them?
We were exercising our functions in pursuit of our statutory duties. Whether every decision we made was perfect with the benefit of hindsight, possibly not, but that's exactly what we were trying to do.
With the benefit of hindsight, would you like to apologise to the taxpayer for being here and potentially putting them in this position where yet again another regulated market could potentially collapse and expose taxpayers to billions of pounds?
I think if you're asking for an apology from Ofwat, I think you should...
Asking for an apology from you, Ms Ross?
No, I won't apologise for my role
Don't
as
want
the
to
Chief
apologise.
Executive as Ofwat, no.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Darren. I think Barry wanted to come in with another
Yes,
quick point.
it's just on the question that my colleagues just raised. If you go through special administration, then of course the shareholders take the hit if the company isn't financially viable, and that's what shareholders are for. And that of course relates to the 560 million question earlier. But the process need not be renationalisation as such. You could actually set up regional local authority bodies to take over and transfer the company as a going concern to those regional local authorities, could you not?
I think that would be possible, yes.
And actually that is the way in which many countries in the rest of the world actually run their water industry, isn't it?
I mean, there is, as I said before, there is a perfectly reasonable debate to be had about the right structure and ownership model.
The question was simple. It was, that is the way that many other countries in the world run their water industry, is it?
Yes, there are a variety of models, and that's one of them.
And they do it actually more successfully in many cases than we happen to have done, don't they?
Can't comment on that.
Well, in terms of the questions that my colleague Philip Dunn put to you earlier.
I haven't got the comparative information about the performance of different regimes.
Finished. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just a couple of final questions. Obviously, you've got very high levels of gearing, as we've already mentioned, but you've just talked about long-term investment and how you're looking at decades ahead. So do you think it was a mistake by the company to have so much of its debt, if its debt, about 50%, actually linked to inflation, rather than taking out more long-term deals, given it's such a long-term business? And was that done maybe because the people lending to the company were so closely connected to the company? And I know you've sort of referred to that, but is it the case that actually the shareholders cope without a dividend because they're getting these interest payments in many cases?
Well, we manage our balance sheet to reflect the period in which we're investing in. So we have debt that's up to 40 years in tenor. The average age is at 13. Critically, the shareholders have put in additional equity to ensure we retain that strong balance sheet so that we continue to be able to borrow money at a efficient rate of interest, and do so
your credit ratings of bonds of late, haven't they?
We still retain an investment grade credit rating, a BBB credit rating, which is a strong investment grade rating. That allows us to borrow money efficiently and therefore keep customer bills down. Okay,
thank you. I think Alan Brown wanted to come in with a quick point.
Thanks, Chair. I'll just think about Alistair at the outset when I asked you about dividends. We've got a briefing, and if you look at Thames utilities, Thames Water utilities accounts, it shows that cumulative dividends paid out was 7.2 billion. So why did you give a much lower figure?
Let me provide you the analysis after this committee.
Yeah, that'd be very good.
Thank you. Finally,
can I just ask?
Yes, please, Philip.
Quickly on that specific point, it would be very helpful if you could, in your reply on dividend payments, separate those which are payments to equity shareholders and those which are characterised as dividends in the accounts, but actually are within the financing structure funding debt payments.
Of course. Because the statement about not our shareholders haven't taken a dividend, it was only referring to the normal shareholders, not the debt financiers. Yeah.
That's absolutely correct. They haven't taken any income for their investment. That's right.
And Ms Ross, having been both involved with Ofwat and obviously Thames Water, do you think the remit of Ofwat could be extended to look maybe a little more deeply into the sort of the financing structures within water companies, rather than just sort of the relationship between the sort of provider and the customer, to get a bit better picture of just where that debt is and how exposed you might be? Because obviously I don't think most people were aware that you were so exposed to high inflation in terms of your debt repayments.
In terms of Ofwat's remit, I mean, I think that's exactly what Ofwat's been doing in recent years. I mean, you can ask them more about it because that's carried on after I left. But certainly from about 2017, if I'm recalling, certainly through 2018 and more recently, they have been paying a lot more attention to what they refer to as financial resilience. And part of that is about gearing and the appropriateness of the capital structure for the sort of investment programs that are needed. And I think that's entirely appropriate.
Okay, thank you. And just before we let you go, Mr. Cochrane, you talked about 151 redundancies. Are those going to be voluntary redundancies? Could you give an assurance? Because obviously there will be people working in the company who will be worried about their jobs and their future. Will there be compulsory redundancies, or are you confident you can fill those redundancies with either early retirement or voluntary redundancies?
To the best of my knowledge, we haven't announced a redundancy programme.
Right. I think the figure I saw was 151 redundancies.
As I say, to the best of my knowledge, we have not announced a redundancy programme. In fact, we have been hiring people consistently. In fact, for example, we onshored our customer service facing team into the region as part of our turnaround plan, and continue to insource activity so that we can get an operational grip on our business to help part of this turnaround.
I see Barry's championing
Mr. Cochrane, why, when I mentioned that earlier, did you not immediately say that? I'm astonished.
I'm delighted to be able to
You
clarify
missed the
now.
point when we talked about it earlier?
Missed that part of the question, I'm sorry.
Okay. Anyway, we put the record straight. So,
Sorry, Chair, if I may, just one further thing, and that is, given that inflation is going to rise and your interest on your debt is going to rise, is it the case that prices are going to go up for customers?
Indeed, under the regulatory model, prices are indexed to inflation.
So why is it that you and others, indeed in Ofwat, and indeed in government, have been saying that there is no possibility that bill payers will see their bills rise?
I think if anybody's said that, that is not...
It's a government minister, actually, I think, as well.
I mean, the regulatory settlements are done on a CPIH plus
Well, indeed, yes.
basis.
We all know your interest payments are going to go up. This is what's precipitated the problem.
Yeah, but
so the question is, how much are they going to go up? What do you actually foresee the rise that your customers are going to have to pay as a result of your company's failure?
Actually, our customers are paying less than they otherwise would as a result of the poor operational performance of the business, because we are in penalty territory in terms of Ofwat's incentive regime. Now, that means that the penalties we pay actually translate into lower bills than would otherwise be the case for customers, because we're not delivering the service.
So we want companies to fail in order that bill payers don't pay as much. Is that what you're saying?
No, but the view is that customers should pay for the service that they receive. We haven't been providing the level of service that customers expect, and therefore we shouldn't charge them at the prices that we would otherwise have charged them.
We're talking about the interest payments on your debt leading through to a rise in the bills that your customers will pay. Is that the case?
No.
No.
No, there is no mechanism within the current price control to enable us to put up bills to reflect higher interest payments.
And so your bill payers can rest assured on the assurance of the co-chief executive of the company that the financial difficulties that you've got yourselves into will not result in their bills rising. Thank you very much.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed for coming and giving us evidence. We'll now move on to our second panel. Thank you very much indeed to our witnesses. Thank you.
Suspended. The proceeding is currently 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 suspended.
Welcome to our second evidence panel from Ofwat. Ofwat as well probably, but could I ask the witnesses to introduce themselves? Ian, I know from my time at the Department for Transport, of course, so welcome and nice to see you again. So could you just introduce yourselves briefly, please?
Well, so, Ian Couch, I'm the chair of Ofwat. I've been there since this time last year, so 12 months.
David Black, Chief Executive at Ofwat.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I ask Robin Moore to start the questioning, please?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. If I said that Ofwat is the economic regulator of water and wastewater sectors in England and Wales, would I be correct?
Yes, that's right.
So how can I, or indeed any members of the committee sat around here, or indeed my constituents, have any confidence in Ofwat when on the 29th of June you express confidence in Thames Water's financial situation, yet Thames Water's debt burden is 20% above your recommended level?
So yes, as the economic regulator, we set an amount of debt level in terms of when we set price controls as what a reasonable, prudent company should have. However, companies have discretion to manage their own financial affairs, and so companies make decisions about the choices they make in terms of debt levels. What we do as a regulator is to protect customers' interests by ensuring that they do not bear the consequences of companies' decision making. And what we've done in the last 2 years is to very much strengthen the provisions around companies having adequate financial resilience. And so our concern is making sure companies have sufficient buffer to deal with uncertainty, to deal with events that may materialise, and that's exactly what we have done. And so we have protected customers' interests, customers protected in terms of the bills they pay and the services they receive, and they will remain so.
And so do you think that you've acted reasonably and responsibly and quickly enough within the situation that we're seeing with Thames Water at the moment?
So Thames Water are responsible, and their shareholders are responsible for their level of debt, and we are holding them to account on behalf of customers.
But how are you holding them to account if we're in this situation that we are at the moment? What action have you taken so far?
Can I just say a few words? So the situation in which Thames finds itself is a consequence of its underperformance. So it's got high levels of gearing. We would like to see the gearing levels down because it does provide, as David says, a greater buffer when things go wrong. So Thames, its problems at the moment are being crystallised because they've got underperformance, so they are not getting the revenue they expect because they're delivering poor service to their customers. So the revenues are down and their costs are higher. So the shareholders are now bearing the extra cost, which means because of the lack of resilience in the company, which we are concerned about, it now needs injection of shareholder funds. So our concern is performance. They are in the situation because performance is not where it needs to be, and we've got similar issues in other companies, but at Thames, their performance is bad. So we have been all over them in addressing their issues about turnaround, improvement, customer services, and costs.
So when you say you've been all over them, why did you on the 29th of June express confidence in their financial position? We're only in July now, that was only last month.
We are confident that in the conversations we've had, they have got sufficient equity commitment coming from the shareholders to address their shortfalls. So we in the short term believe that the right course of action at this point in time, because they haven't got financial resilience, is the shareholders to inject equity to support the business as it stands today.
So Ofwat expressed confidence in Thames Water's financial position on the 29th of June. We're now in July. You are here recognising that they have got challenges now with their financial position. Thames Water has raised 750 million of the 1 billion it requires. You've mentioned short term there. What is the impact going to be on customers, on my constituents and indeed constituents of those sat around the table here?
Before we respond to that, I think we should make very clear that in December last year we published a report saying we were unhappy with Thames's financial resilience and that action was required. At that time, the company had committed to £1.5 billion of equity injections, and on that basis, so that was the basis, that was our view at that time.
But it hasn't raised that level of funding, though, has it?
It's not that on 29th of June we've suddenly changed our position. We were very clear and have been clear for some time that Thames has inadequate financial resilience and that they need to address that. So just to be clear on that.
Okay, so over that time frame, Thames hasn't raised that level of funding. Is that correct?
So they've injected the £500 million as they committed to recently, and it was the remaining £1 billion, which they have now reached agreement with the shareholders to support a £750 million injection in the company. So that's the change, and that was our concern and why we were engaging with the company ahead of their financial reports about the shareholders' commitment, and those are the discussions that we've been having with the company.
So do you feel as a regulator that you've taken sufficient enough action, despite having first raised it in December and not giving as stark a warning as I would like to see from a regulator on the 29th of June?
I think our warning in December last year was unambiguous and clear that they had insufficient
financial
financial
resilience. Do you feel
resilience.
as a regulator that you've taken sufficient enough action since the warning that was put out in December last year?
Yes, but we were also engaged before that. We were having discussions. Shortly after I was appointed as acting chief executive, I was discussing with the then chief executive of Thames Water about our concerns about their financial resilience, and it was those and in terms of we have an annual process where we look at the company's assurance around their adequacy of financial resources and about how the company was going to demonstrate that, and that was the outcome of those conversations were the company's commitment to inject the £1.5 billion into the business. So we've been engaged with Thames on their financial resilience for some time. The shareholders are responding, but we remain concerned that there are significant issues to address, and as Ian said, significant performance issues in terms of the turnaround of the company.
So how are you as a regulator going to ensure that that challenge is addressed and their debt burden is going to be brought down?
So in terms of, the first thing is for the company is to get a plan that will secure their turnaround. So they've obviously made a number of attempts to turn around their business. Those haven't succeeded at this point, and we continue to hold the company to account on their performance to date, and so imposing financial penalties on the company for their failures to deliver for customers. We have a number of licensed powers, but we have powers, for example, in terms of the payment of dividends, which we've just brought into place, but we also will examine their assurances around their financial resilience, which they have provided to us on this past Monday, and we'll work through that and engage with the company. We will remain in discussion with the company about their ability to secure financing from shareholders.
So, I mean, one of my concerns is that ultimately, as a result of Thames's poor management, this is likely to result in customer bills going up.
No. Can I be unequivocal on that? So we set companies allowed cost of capital, allowed returns on the basis of an efficient, well-functioning company. So Thames shareholders are up for the additional costs associated with their poor performance, and that is evidenced by the fact they've had to inject additional funding into the company, and they've had very little in the way of dividend payments over the last 7 years.
So you were very quick to come out with a no there, but over what time period does that relate to?
So in terms of, we reset price reviews every 5 years, but the key point is we're saying that we will allow Thames the efficient costs of running the business. Now that may vary, and we will set that again as part of the 2024 price review.
So you can only confidently say no up until 2024, is that correct? Or beyond that?
Not at all, because we have a policy position. So whether bills are going up or bills are going down, that will be determined by the needs from a customer and an environmental perspective, and we will set bills on the basis of Thames's efficient costs and an efficient cost of financing. And so that will be the basis for setting bills, and it won't be about Thames's actual debt burden or actual costs of debt. Thames customers do not pay a penny more for Thames's 80% gearing versus other companies' 60% gearing.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Alan Jones.
Thank you. Last year, my committee did a major inquiry into the collapse of the energy market and highlighted a number of failings at the energy regulator, Ofgem, which they're now dealing with. Have you been working with Ofgem to learn the lessons from the energy market as it relates to the water market?
Yes, we welcome your report, and we have considered it. We've also engaged with Ofgem and their advisors they engaged with during that process. So, for example, we had the consultancy they commissioned to do the independent review come in and speak to our senior leadership team and talk through their view about the lessons learned for Ofgem.
Okay, so having considered my committee's report, what do you think the main takeaway is that you need to now change at Ofwat to secure the future of the water industry?
So we think the key changes we have made are the bringing into being of new conditions in company licences around payment of dividends and financial resilience. So under the Environment Act 2021, we received new powers to amend company licences. Up until that point, we didn't, in our view, have sufficient power to change company licences. We have now used those powers. The first target of our use of those powers was around strengthening provisions on financial resilience. The second change we're making is about improving customer protection and customer service.
In 2022, Ofwat started financial monitoring of water companies, according to the review of your 2014 price review that was published on your website. Were you not doing this before?
So we've published a financial monitoring report since 2016. So we've published a series of reports every year. They come out, we look at companies' financial statements they provide to us. We do our analysis on a range of financing issues around companies, including their debt structures, their dividend payments, and their plans for equity, and so we've been doing that since 2016.
And did you raise issues about Thames Water in 2016?
So we identified that they had high levels of gearing, that they had financial ratios that did raise concerns.
Why has nothing happened about that?
So Thames have been able to finance their activities, and so there hasn't been so we have been engaging with the company, and we have raised concerns about it. But frankly, our concerns at the time were more focused on Southern Water, where we have secured injections of equity into that company, and Yorkshire Water, we have also secured equity injections in that company. We have now more focused on Thames, recognising the issues that they're facing. But at the time, those issues were less severe than faced by the companies I've just named.
Shouldn't you be focusing on all of the companies you regulate, not just one at any given time?
We do, but the point I was making is that we were engaged with the shareholders of Southern at that time to in terms of securing their exit from the business and the entry into that business of new shareholders who were able to inject £1 billion into Southern Water.
In the previous panel, the new chairman of Thames Water said that we need to enter a period of transparency where the water companies are transparent with the regulator. The implication of that is that they haven't been in the past. Is that right?
They have provided information to us on their financing. I think what I would say is they weren't sufficiently transparent with the public. Obviously, company financing issues are complex. We've criticised them for being opaque. We have introduced licence conditions to require companies to provide more adequate financial information. But I think there's a huge challenge for companies in explaining in plain English what's going on with their financing structures, where the money's coming from and where it's going to.
I think you said that from 2025 you're going to reduce the debt target from 60% to 55%. Is that right?
As part of the price review, yes, we use a notional gearing target, and that is the signal that we think there should be prudent headroom in financing structures. So we're using that to signal to investors and to companies that we think their equity buffer needs to increase as they face the challenges of the future. They're going to be making large investment programs. They're facing the challenges of climate change, and we're also increasing the level of financial penalties on companies. So we want them to have adequate financial structures to bear that.
Only 3 of the 11 water companies that you regulate have debt below 60% today. What is the consequence if they don't hit your debt target from 2025?
So what we're concerned about is adequacy of financial resilience. And so that doesn't rest on gearing alone. So I think we need to be quite clear that the gearing number is useful.
Could you try that in just plain English for me? Forgive me. So what happens if they don't hit your debt target? What's the consequence for the company?
We're not setting a target in terms of companies to...
Why do you call it a debt target if it's not a target?
Because that's the basis for setting the price review, which is about making sure we're protecting customers' interests. So customers are paying a bill based on a 55% gearing target rather than the actual gearing the company has, which relates to the question earlier about how we protect customers' interests. So we're saying that we're going to set customer bills on this basis. If companies have different financing structures, they bear those consequences. So it's really important that shareholders and companies are responsible for their financial structures. We are here to protect customers' interests, and that's what we're doing.
My last question is on consequences. You've made the point repeatedly that you protect customers, and you've talked about customer bills. You recognise, though, do you, that there is a scenario in which the taxpayer would have to pick up the cost of a failed water company because they are too important to fail. Do you ever think about the risk to taxpayers of bankrupt water companies when you're looking at protecting consumer interests?
I think you're referring to the special administration regime. So the situation in water, as with other regulated industries, is that a special administrator will be appointed if a company is in danger of insolvency. It is their job then to deliver services to customers, to protect customers' interests, but also to secure new owners for the companies. And in contrast perhaps to the energy companies you looked at, water companies have very large asset bases. And so in the first instance, we think costs around special administration will be borne by investors. We do accept that there is a risk for taxpayers, and so that is one of the reasons why we've been working to drive increased financial resilience into companies. Why we've used our new powers we've received under the Environment Act to change licence conditions to tighten up on financial resilience.
The public will look at what's being reported as happening in the water industry, having just gone through what happened in the energy industry last year. And the risk here is that the government taxpayers have to borrow enormous amounts of money to underwrite the risks that companies have been allowed to take. And the public will see, once again, companies like Macquarie cashing out, walking away with their money, the previous CEO of the regulator refusing to apologise for the fact that we're in this position in the first place. And the public will say, what are the consequences? Who is responsible for exposing taxpayers in this way? Do you, albeit as the newer chief executive of the water regulator, want to apologise on behalf of your predecessors for ending up in this position in the first place?
So just in terms of, I think it's very, we need to be careful about the parallel with the energy sector. And so, as I've explained, energy companies which failed have very little in the way of assets. We're talking about, in the Thames case, a £19 billion company. And so the question is, can the equity holders or needs must debt holders bear the consequences of that?
Mr. Black, a taxpayer and a customer is the same person. It's still a person paying out money either to the government or to a company. My question was whether you recognise the failure of the water regulator over these many years that's got us into this position in the first place, and whether now, as the chief executive of the water regulator, much like the chief executive of the energy regulator did last year, you want to apologise for the public for the position we're in today.
So we continue to protect customers' interests. We are not in a position of either Thames being in special administration.
You think everything's okay right now? Is that what you're saying?
No, I don't. I think there's some very serious issues that Thames Water need to address. But my point is that customers' interests remain protected by the regime. We're not at the point where, as I've been very clear, that customers are having to pay any more for Thames's financial issues or for their poor performance, and that remains so. And as I've explained, the situation in energy is different from water, as in water companies have much greater capacity to absorb the consequences, or should I say their shareholders.
I understand. You've made the point, Mr. Black. Just very lastly, because I'm going to be testing the patience of the Chair.
I'm a very patient person.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, I'll keep going in that case. Do you therefore not have a request of the government to enhance or extend your powers? Because it seems to me that both you, Mr. Black, and your predecessor, Ms. Ross, in the previous panel, have said to us, it's up to the companies how they run their businesses, and don't worry, because if it goes wrong, the government's probably not going to have to nationalise it anyway. That's not what it looks like from where I'm sitting. So I would want you and the other regulators to be in a position where, when you're regulating a company that is too important to fail, you actually know what's going on at that business, and you have the power to make sure they don't end up in a position like they're in now. So do you need additional powers from the government to do that job properly?
So I agree that the issues you're raising are very serious, and I agree that up until 2021 we didn't feel we had sufficient powers to address those issues. So the crucial change for us in 2021 was our ability to amend company licences, and so the licence is the instrument we use to regulate companies. We now think we have sufficient flexibility in terms of amending licences, both in terms of the changes we have already made, but if we think further changes are required, to go ahead and make those changes. So we think the government has now given us the additional powers. We've also received additional funding, or the ability to raise additional funding, so we can resource up to exercise those new powers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. Cat Smith.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Black, earlier in response to a question from my colleague Mr. Jones there, you did say that the water companies were being transparent with yourselves as the regulator, but not necessarily with their customers. I'm just wondering, I'm left wondering, what on earth is the point of a regulator if then you're not communicating that with the public?
So we think companies have a responsibility to communicate clearly with their customers, and so that was the question I was responding to. We are able to get information from companies. We require them to provide annual information to us of considerable detail. We also have a 5-yearly business plan where they set out their 5-yearly projections.
Mr. Black, I'm sorry, but if you know that companies are not being transparent with their customers and you know what's going on, why is Ofwat not communicating that with them?
We want companies to take responsibility for communicating to their customers. We have changed company licences to require them to do that. So we think that they are now taking steps to do that. But the point I would make is that it is challenging to explain these issues to customers, and I think quite clearly customers do not feel that they have sufficient information.
What is taking steps in that situation?
So in terms of, we can set guidelines in terms of what companies ought to be doing, in terms of what they publish.
Guidelines are obviously optional then, yes?
We also have requirements of what companies publish.
What are the requirements?
So the companies do publish annual financial statements, they do set out. So the question is not so much they set out the information, it is about communicating that in an understandable form to their customers. So we think the information
why the public are kind of questioning what is the point of your organisation when it does appear that you have done absolutely nothing to inform them about some of the risks that these companies are taking. And I am left wondering whether or not this model that we have of water ownership in this country, which is completely out of step with what is probably the international norm here, is working, because it strikes me that in 2017 the FT reported in a 10-year review of company accounts that on profits of £20.7 billion, water companies paid an average tax rate of 8%. Who benefits from water privatisation?
So in terms of since privatisation, £190 billion have been invested. So that has driven significant improvements in service, so improvements in water quality, improvements, reductions in the levels of pollution, and improvements in customer service, reductions in water supply interruptions. So there's water investment, capital investment in the sector is about double at the rate pre-privatisation. So clearly the question about the ownership of companies is a matter for government, not for Ofwat. But you can point to tangible investments under the regulated model of more investment and better service. That said, we're under no illusions. There are real problems for the sector to address. The situation on sewage spills and storm overflows is unacceptable. Now that we have the information about those discharges, action has been taken. But I should point out that these are issues that exist in other jurisdictions as well. There are a problem in Scotland, there are a problem in other countries as well. It does require a concerted effort to address. It will require more investment, and we are part of that process.
We've had 34 years of water privatisation, and why is it that we're still talking about this desperate need for investment? If privatisation was meant to be the answer to this investment question 34 years ago, why are we still in this situation today? Is it because of the regulator, or is it because of the water companies?
So in terms of areas of where companies have fallen short of performance, so we've been very clear with the committee that we think the performance of Thames Water is poor. It needs to improve. There are other companies where we have concerns about as well. We think there are sector-wide issues to address. But again, as I point out, if you look at other countries, other jurisdictions, they are facing the same challenges, issues of climate change, high-density urban areas, addressing particularly with older infrastructure issues, about making in terms of getting better performance that in line with what the public would expect. And so that we can point to significant investment since privatisation, we can point to significant improvements, but there's clearly a huge
Why is privatisation so unpopular? Whenever we see public polling on the idea of renationalisation of water companies, it's incredibly popular with the public. Why do you think that is?
I don't think that's a question for me to answer. I think you as an MP will be much better placed than me to address that question.
Is it because of the absolute utter failure of the water companies in England right now?
We can point to huge improvements in service, huge levels of investment. Clearly, we accept the public is dissatisfied with companies. We've done some research which suggests that trust in companies have fallen over the last 3 years. We think it's really important the sector address those issues. Ian and I called companies' chairs and chief executives in to really make the point that they need to improve performance. We are seeing signs of change in the water sector, but much more change is needed. And this is not about who owns the companies. This is about companies really adopting much more forward-looking management practices, so investing in smart grids, smart networks, should I say, smart metering, using nature-based solutions at scale, and really modernising the way companies work. And we will continue to push the sector to do just that.
Can I just say a couple of words, Kat? It's a really good question about the privatised water model. So it has been privatised for 30-odd years. £190 billion has gone into investment in the sector. That's £4, £5, £6 billion a year. I would worry that in a nationalised situation that the call on that kind of investment wouldn't be there. So the money wouldn't be available, so it is going in. Why are we facing such an investment crisis now? It's because the nature of investment is changing. So we've got to address things like water resilience. We now need more water to cope with population growth, urbanisation, climate change. There's changing standards on levels of water abstraction that the Environment Agency is pushing through, the drive towards net zero, and the need to address the stormwater overflow. So that is a very, very significant step up investment that we've not seen in the past, and that is causing some concerns about the future.
My final question, if I may, Chair, is just about particularly about Thames Water. Can I ask what plans have been put in place to prepare Thames Water for potential failure and what that might look like?
What we call contingency planning for the failure of a water company is something we keep under review. And in terms of our concerns about Thames Water, we have been looking very closely at the arrangements that need to be taken, and we are confident that we can rise to the contingencies that may occur. But we think it's prudent planning to be ready for special administration. But as the company noted this morning, they have sufficient liquidity to meet the challenges of the immediate future, and shareholder commitment for additional funding. Should those materialise, then obviously this planning won't be needed, but we think it's prudent as a regulator that we prepare for these outcomes, and we've been working on that.
Would you say you're confident that the special administration regime will not be needed in the case of Thames Water?
I think we need to remain ready to employ that.
Do you think you'll be deploying it?
I think at this point in time, the company is saying that they have secured commitments from their shareholders, and so
believe them.
So it won't be needed. Obviously, so in terms of, I think it's great that the company have secured the commitment from their shareholders, but clearly there is, the money has not yet arrived into the company, and so that at that point we will feel more confident.
Can I just add a little tiny bit? One of the reasons we're doing a lot of contingency planning now is to learn the lessons of bulb. What that would mean. It's the most recent example of administration. So we're working with our colleagues across government to say, in the unlikely circumstances it happens, are we ready? Have we got everything in place? So we don't think it's likely at the moment for the reasons David said, but it would be sensible for everybody just to think about the possible implications.
You do not think it's likely?
At this point in time, we're confident the shareholders will inject some cash, but the problems at Thames are deep-rooted. And I'll repeat what I said before. The problems at Thames are a function of cost overruns and poor performance, and they need to fix that as quickly as possible. Otherwise, they will have the same problems in the future.
Have you been asleep at the wheel as the regulator?
No.
Okay. Chair.
Thank you. I think Darren wants to come in very quickly.
Very quick follow-up. It's great to hear that you're trying to learn the lessons from the bulb failure. One of the issues with the energy companies that collapsed last year was the capital that the Treasury had to provide to keep them running as going concerns. Bulb was huge for the energy market, but is actually quite small compared to Thames Water. What's the assessment been for the Treasury in terms of the amount of capital it needs to put aside should Thames Water fail?
So we've been working on those issues. I'm not going to name a number in terms of where we're at in the process, but as I've noted, there's quite big differences between Bulb, which is a relatively asset-light company exposed to energy market fluctuations, and Thames, which is a large capital-intensive business with larger asset base and ability to raise funding.
When the energy market failure was happening, both the regulator and the government wrote to my committee confidentially to tell us those numbers. Will you commit to do that to this committee?
I think we'd probably refer that to Treasury. Those are questions for them, really.
Okay, thank you.
I think, could you sort of give taxpayers an assurance that if there were to be a special administration, this wouldn't be the taxpayer bailing out the shareholders? They would have already lost their shirts, and it would be a case of picking up the pieces, more like the banks, I suspect, than the energy companies. And that, who knows, if the company performed well, they could well be sold back into the private sector, as we've seen with some of the bank shares.
Yeah, so the company would remain an attractive interest for other potential investors, and so, as I say, they've got a £19 billion asset base. They have a secure revenue stream. So the question will be in terms of the interest of the existing shareholders. So they're the first in terms of their equities at risk. They're well aware of that. Then there's a question about the debt holders in the company.
Might be the same people we heard in the first session.
I don't think in the main that is the case.
Okay. Thank you. Barry.
Yes, thank you, Chair. First of all, let me make it absolutely clear. I understand you came into the business only in July last year, and Mr. Black, you came in, I think, in April just before that. So you are left responding for things that happened broadly before your tenure, and I just want to say we appreciate that. If we go back, let's go back to 2003, South East Water. And you'll remember that Macquarie purchased South East Water then. They sold it 3 years later for almost double what they purchased it for, and they had by that time increased the debt more than fourfold. In effect, they repeated that with Thames Water, only it was a much bigger prospect, Thames Water, and they increased the debt threefold there. And instead of it being the case that companies raising debt in this way would use it to increase the infrastructure for the benefit of the public good, they actually took 2.7 billion out of it, and 2.2 billion of that was in loans. So you've rightly, and you've reiterated it to this committee, you've rightly said that we're very concerned about the gearing, not only of this company, but of others in the sector. And the higher debt, that gearing, gives a notional lower cost of capital, of financing, doesn't it? So lower charges then result in the short term. But my accusation against Ofwat would be that you've basically you've encouraged over-leveraging. And I have to say the two of you are not entirely innocent of this, because of course in August of last year, after both of you came into post, you encouraged the purchase by Macquarie of Southern Water. Now, you knew its track record. You know what this company does. You know it over-leverages. You know that in the short term that can get charges down, but when it goes wrong and financing costs increase, we see the debacle that we've had with Thames Water. So it seems to me that Ofwat, over a long period of time, has been guilty of encouraging over-leveraging, and the immediate charge that I would lay at your two doors is that you did exactly the same thing just after you came into post with Southern Water.
So just in terms of to contextualise, so going back to around early 2000, so the sector asset, so if I go right back to the start of privatisation, the sector asset base was £9 billion. It was fully financed by equity at that point. Today, the sector asset base is around £85 billion, and debt levels are around £57 billion. So that growth in asset base of 77 billion pounds since privatisation, 57 billion pounds has been financed by debt and about 20 billion from equity. So when we look at the picture across the sector, debt has been a key source of finance, not the only source of finance. And that was intended at privatisation, so that debt levels would increase to fund the growth of asset base.
Over ground where we agree.
Yes, yeah. So now can I move on
over ground where we disagree.
So yes, so now moving on to the cases that you've talked through in terms of, and it's a very knowledgeable question in terms of South East Water and the Macquarie's ownership of Thames. I would agree that Macquarie's ownership of Thames, that they did gear up the company to very high levels. They extracted that in form of dividends, and that's the reasons why we have changed the licences once we've had the power to do so. However, we've been very clear that about the new basis and our new expectations of investors. So, and just coming to the specifics of Southern Water, Macquarie's injected £1 billion into the Southern Water Group. They're now standing by to inject a further £500 million. They have had very little in the way of dividends out of that company. So I take some satisfaction, and we've got new controls on dividends now, so they cannot get the money out of the business so we have the ability to intervene. So I take some satisfaction, actually, that Macquarie's as an investor are injecting money into the sector rather than taking it out of it, and we have the arrangements in place to protect customers' interests.
Well, it goes back to your response to my colleague Darren Jones, doesn't it? That actually, what is this target about, the gearing that you want? If you can't enforce it, what gives you the assurance that Macquarie are not going to do with Southern Water exactly what they did with Thames and exactly what they did with South East.
Can I just say, the difference is the new financial resilience measures we put in place, which prevent companies taking dividends out of the company when they're poorly performing or when they're not justified. We didn't have that power before.
Sorry, and I don't know the answer to this question. That's rare when I ask
point for questions, Barry.
No, it's not. I assure you it's not, Chair. Usually I know the answer to the question that I'm asking. So let me ask you, Mr. Coucher, are you saying that in a highly complicated debt structure like WBS in Thames Water, that you have the power to stop dividends going to each of those debt payers and not only to what everybody would normally understand as being the shareholders, the equity shareholders?
We have the powers to stop dividends being released from the operating company. So where they go beyond that is a matter of the company. But we would, the financial powers that we have got, retain the dividends that would have been paid inside the company if we're not satisfied that they are performing and they've not satisfied they have sufficient financial resilience. We didn't have that power before, we do now. And the Southern one is a good case in point working. So Southern, Macquarie have gone in there with a group of investors. They've looked at the business. They now realise they now need to inject further equity because of the base, and that is what they're doing precisely now. And we are confident that the situation that happened at a decade or so ago is now protected.
Thank you. So what you're saying is, had these new arrangements been in place when our previous witness was the CEO of the organisation, and subsequently, what happened with what happened with Thames Water could not have happened.
We would have had the ability to block the dividends going out of the company, yes.
So I think, again, it was a question from my colleague Darren Jones to her when she denied that they had failed in any way or lacked any powers to do so. That is one way in which the debacle could have been prevented. Yeah, thank you. So are you confident that going forward, no company, no part of the ownership of the company would be able to receive the level of returns that Macquarie was extracting from Thames Water, between 15.9 and 19%. That's over double the normal return that regulated.
So we've set aside, we've changed the license to make those, to give us the power to do that. But furthermore, we've now got more flexibility with the license. If we think further changes are required, we will introduce them.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think Rosie wanted to come in with a supplementary on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going over some ground covered by Darren Jones and Kat Smith, I'm afraid, but my constituents would really like to know, I mean, do you understand why in the coastal town of Whitstable, for example, they don't have a lot of faith in Ofwat or the Environment Agency or anyone else that is supposed to be imposing fines and stopping? You know, we know that you imposed these record fines against Southern Water, for example, but nothing has actually practically and physically changed. Every time we get a thimbleful of rain, there's sewage released into the sea, which affects every aspect of daily life in a town like Whitstable. Can you just maybe, you know, can I just give you the chance to kind of briefly explain to them why they should have faith in you, what you can do? I mean, you've talked about improving customer service, revoking licenses, stopping shareholders getting dividends, and that customers' interests remain protected. Can you convince my constituents that you're doing your job?
Where do we get this? So the issue of stormwater overflows is appalling. You know, we have said this, and I have said this to committee before. The over-reliance and use of stormwater overflows to deal with rainfall, as you suggest, is unacceptable. So what we've been very clear to everybody that if a company, and this is the same for the Environment Agency, if a company is in breach of its legal or regulatory obligations, they will take action and they will force compliance, and the companies will be responsible for rectifying the problems. We have got ourselves in a situation where some of these stormwater overflows do allow under permits to release sewage into water systems. So we need to tighten up all of those permits to say to people, that is no longer acceptable. So you might have a permit today, but we need to see that tightened over the course of time. But we will enforce and ensure companies comply with the law, comply with their environmental obligations and their permitting requirements, and the cost of doing so is for the companies themselves. We have got 6 concurrent large-scale investigations into the companies that have been doing this to satisfy ourselves that they are complying with the legal obligations and complying with environmental permits. They are complicated. I don't wish to trivialise it, but we are working through that, and we know our colleagues at the EA are doing exactly the same.
Okay, thank you. If they're still within those legal limits, though, and sewage is still spilling out every time it rains, who is then responsible for changing that or imposing different legal limits? Or, I mean, is that us? So you're saying we need to come back and change that, or DEFRA needs to...
That's a different environment agency. So it's the environment agency that permits each and every storm discharge, and so that's the arrangement.
Can we just refer to the DEFRA's water plan for water, which does set much lower targets for the use of these stormwater flows. It's going to take time, but it's down to
the government has set out a £56 billion plan to address this issue. I've been on site at Whitstable, so there is scope to make quick improvements, which the company's in the process of making, but then there are some quite significant issues which will require investment to address.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, I think Philip Durham wanted to come in.
I'll just come in after Neil Hudson's question.
Okay. Neil.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to follow up quickly before I get on to my sort of main question about Mr. Coucher. You've been before us before, and I've asked you about the teeth that you have in terms of putting pressure on the water companies, and we've talked about fines and then not allowing dividends to go out. We've talked about financial performance today, and Rosie's been touching on the sort of sewage outflows as well. Do you feel that the teeth you have, if water companies are having these unacceptable and immoral sewage discharges into our watercourses, do you feel that you have the teeth? And what are those teeth? Would they be with the fines, or can you potentially stop the dividends going out if they are breaching the sewage outflows as well? Or is it more financial performance that you're going to be using that particular tooth?
I'll ask David to ask to say, but I would just say that yes, we have got the power to enforce compliance, to address any aspect of underperformance through either fines, withholding dividend payments if we think they are in breach of their obligations.
But is the underperformance, it could be about sewage rather than financial underperformance?
Yes.
Okay. So we have a set of performance commitments. We also have obligations that we enforce on companies in terms of the operation of their sewage systems, and so that's what we're investigating with our 6 cases. We will have the ability to impose financial penalties. We've imposed £250 million of penalties on companies in the last 5 years. We won't hesitate to use those powers.
I reassure the committee and the public watching this that you will use those teeth to hold those water companies to account.
Can I just add one extra thing? When I did appear to you before, who will answer it? When I appeared to you before, you were asking a very similar question. So, in the last 12 months, what we have done, we've secured additional funding from Treasury and through DEFRA to allow us to ramp up our investigation capabilities, that we are empowering our people to be much more intrusive on companies' performance. So it's a more muscular approach, that when we see companies not performing below where we're expecting, we have had them in and we've said, we would like a rectification plan from you. Your performance is not acceptable. Please give us a turnaround plan to rectify that. That is new. We didn't do that before, and in the first part of this year, we had 5 companies in to say, we are not satisfied. Please give us an improvement programme. And that's a result of the extra powers that we've secured in extra funds. Sorry, David, that was a question.
Yes, so we think we do have the powers. I mean, as noted, there is the role of the Environment Agency in terms of setting permits at sites, but we have the powers. We have the ability to impose large financial penalties up to 10% of turnover on.
You've got the powers. Can you just reassure us and the public that you will use those powers?
Yes, we're taking enforcement action against 6 large wastewater companies at present. And I know these investigations do take time and people are impatient to see results. I am as well, but we are making good progress and we will have announcements to come on that.
I wanted to move back on to the topic that we touched on earlier today in terms of staffing and leadership and the relationship between the regulator and the sector. And we know that one of our previous witnesses, the new interim chief joint chief executive Thames Water, was formerly one of your predecessors. Mr. Black, at Ofwat. Do you feel that are the high numbers of senior Ofwat staff moving to potentially higher paid positions in private water companies? Do you feel that is problematic at all for your ability to maintain trust in Ofwat's role and motives?
Firstly, just to reassure, we do all departures from Ofwat are covered by civil service business appointment rules, which do allow us to impose conditions on staff for up to 2 years after they leave in terms of the work they undertake and how they. So that's important. I think the other point I'd make is in terms of contextualising this. There's been lots of media reports on this issue, but they're talking about numbers which amount to 2 or 3 staff members per year leaving Ofwat. We're an organisation of over 300 people. Each one of the, and a number of those members didn't go from Ofwat to a water company, they went Ofwat to another employer to a water company.
You mentioned these media reports. You recognise the figures of about 27 former Ofwat directors, managers and consultants who are now currently working with private water companies. Do you recognise those figures?
I recognise those figures, but the point I would make is that a number of those people left Ofwat to go to work either in another sector or not for a water company, and then later on, some years later, have gone to work for a water company. And so I think it does need to be seen in that context. We do have strict rules about what people do upon leaving Ofwat, and so I think these numbers do not support any kind of the contention that's been made.
We recognise that in the public sector there are finite resources in terms of the salaries that can be paid, and we understand that. Professor Sudhita Helm at Oxford University has said there is a merry-go-round between the core regulators and the regulated utilities. Regulators are not paid well, and if there is a potential of future jobs in the firms they regulate, it creates potential conflicts of interest. Do you concur with that statement at all?
I don't accept. I mean, I work with an incredible bunch of very dedicated people. As I say, most of whom do not go to work for water companies. So I think they do a fantastic job. They're very dedicated to the public interest, to protecting customers' interests. And it's probably worth noting that Professor Helm also works for these water companies and is engaged by them. So I have a question for you.
Fair point.
Same.
Fair point. And I do very much take on board what you say, that the people that work for your organisation work so hard to try and do the best to improve the water quality for our country. But for you as two leaders of that regulator, does it concern you, that potential pull and drag into the private sector, that it is draining you of the vital resource that you need to do the best job that you can?
Again, just to contextualise that, I think only one member of Ofwat's senior leadership team, which is Catherine Ross, you've seen earlier, has left Ofwat, and she didn't go to a water company, she went to BT, but has ultimately ended up in a water company. So
it doesn't worry you then?
So no, I think people.
Archer, what do you?
It doesn't look good. I accept that, but I'd like to assure the committee, to anybody, we have processes and governance regimes to make sure that decisions are syndicated, they're taken thoughtfully, and considering that no one individual really has the powers to make decisions which may be biased or whatever may be. So I'm reasonably reassured that the decision-making process we've got protects that. But I do accept that on the face of it, people could ask questions, but for David's reasons, it's not really an issue. There's a small number of people, they tend to be more junior people, and they tend to end up in the regulatory departments of these big organisations, which tends to be a bit of a specialist skill. So understandably, they've got skills, knowledge and capabilities about the process, which is valuable to companies. But I do accept your observation.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think
very briefly, I'm just following that point up, just for the avoidance of doubt and for clarity and reassuring the public. Can you confirm that you, Ian, have no financial interest in a water company or a company which is a major supplier to a water company?
I have got no interest at all in any water company, any supplier to the water industry.
Thank you. And David, can you give us the same reassurance?
Yes, that's right. I have no interest in any water company.
Thank you. And for anybody you bring into the company, whether an executive or non-executive, into Ofwat rather than the company, you receive a similar assurance?
Yes. Yeah, it's very clear upon entering employment at Ofwat, you're not allowed to own shares in a water company.
Thank you.
Thank you. David, you talked about, obviously you produce a financial monitoring report which delves into some of the way these companies are funded, but you also said that sometimes they were fairly opaque mechanisms. Do you think having more powers to sort of delve into some of these opaque funding streams would help you, or do you feel you've got enough powers at the moment?
I think we have adequate powers to require information from companies. There is a question about the level of resources and expertise required, and so we are looking to beef up our resources in that space. And so I guess my key question is, do we have the resources in that space? And that's why I'm pleased we've got the additional funding to strengthen our capabilities. But it is a complex area. It's an area of specialist expertise. So it's not just about having the information, it's about having the expertise to understand what's going on and to ask the right questions to companies.
Just following on from Neil's point, you said only one person has moved from Ofwat to, I think the figure we saw was 27.
So one member of the senior leadership team, which is Catherine Ross, so the 27 people are referred to over the period of time, I think is about 2 to 3 employees a year.
We'd had that figure before.
Sorry, Chair, I don't think that's accurate either. 6 of the 9 companies in England have hired directors of corporate strategy or heads of regulation who previously worked of Ofwat. Andrew Beaver, Northumbrian Water, former Director of Strategy and Planning, Ian McGuffock, now at Southern Water, Ross at Thames Water, Jonathan Reid, Director of Regulatory Policy. There's a number
None of those
individuals.
were members of Ofwat's senior leadership team, just to be clear.
Did you have senior leadership positions?
They've gone on to
companies?
senior positions within their company, within the companies that they've joined. Half of the 27 have gone on to senior leadership positions in the companies that they've joined.
Whilst they're off what, they weren't a member of the leadership team there, they were lower down the hierarchy.
Perfect. Well, we're bang on the time I had in the back of my mind for moving on to the final evidence session. So thank you very much indeed, and thank you, David, for coming and giving us such useful evidence. Thank you. Order.
Thank you.
Order.
Thank you very much for your interest.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Well, thank you, and welcome to our panel for the second session. If I could ask you to introduce yourself, starting with the Minister, I think.
Good morning, Chair. Rebecca Powell, Environment Minister, also Water Minister, comes under my portfolio.
And I'm David Hill. I'm the Director General for the Environment in DEFRA.
Perfect, thank you. If I could start, Minister, with the question. We heard how, in the worst scenario, if there was a failure, we've been looking at some of the energy companies, the banks, if there was a failure and the water companies had to go into special administration, how concerned are you about the potential failure at Thames Water and other providers in the sector? Is it on your radar?
Well, as the Water Minister, obviously, I'm looking at all the water companies and working very closely to make sure Ofwat are doing their job as the regulator. So they would be highlighting things to us constantly, of course, and we were very mindful of their resilience report that they came out with earlier in the year. In terms of the special administration order that you're referring to, of course, should a water company no longer be able to fulfil its financial obligations, the Secretary of State and Ofwat have got powers to apply for this on insolvency grounds. But I've been made fully aware, and in fact the new chairman, Sir Adrian, came in to see the Secretary of State just yesterday, who gave absolute assurances that we are nowhere near that situation. But a government would always have to have the measures in place should they ever be required.
Would you agree that they've been skating on dangerously thin ice with 8% gearing and half their debt linked to inflation, with inflation rates rising? Obviously, there's been alarm bells ringing all around, not just Thames Water, but other water companies who are so highly geared and so exposed to debt repayments.
Well, obviously we've looked really closely at this whole issue of debt and gearing and how the whole system works in terms of attracting outside funding, in terms of equity or raising debt, because obviously the water companies have got to pay for all of the investment, the huge investment in infrastructure. And let's not forget that since privatisation, investment has actually doubled compared to what it was before privatisation, and it's attracted in £190 billion.
HS2s, or maybe
money,
maybe not.
Yeah, money which you know, what one might say we would have struggled to have attracted had we not gone through this process of privatisation. Because if you talk to people, we might call it back in the old days, Robert, but I think you and I were around, and I've met with a whole lot of people actually who were involved pre-privatisation and then saw the system through and now privatisation, for them to reflect on their thoughts on it. You know, and the water system was in a terrible state. You know, we did have terrible leakage. We had masses of interruptions to supply. And we cut leakage by, I think, a third. We've cut supply outages by a fifth. You know, so there's been huge improvements. So I honestly think we must not forget to tell that story. That's not to say there is not an awful lot we have to keep our eye on, and we have to make sure our water companies are delivering what we need now in also a changing world. I think the chair of Ofwat referred to that. We've got huge demands on us now because also of climate change and so forth. But in terms of I think you asked the question about the gearing. Obviously, Ofwat did indicate in their financial resilience report that they had some concerns about Thames. That's why you know, they're working with them very, very closely. But I think, and I'd like to draw the committee's attention to those statements that we've had from Ofwat and Thames Water. So on the 29th of June, we had a statement that emphasised that Thames Water had a strong liquidity position, which included £4.4 billion of cash and committed funding. And we've just had the Thames Water announcement, haven't we, this week, with the accounts via the annual report, that they've secured a further, some money was committed earlier in the year, but we've had a further £750 million of equity investment.
That was a shortfall on the billion that was suggested needed to be injected, though, wasn't it?
Yeah, but I think they gave some adequate answers. I've been listening to, you know, this is the money that needs to be spent soon, and they need to know that they've got it. And the company knows that the shareholders know that they'll be seeking another £2.5 billion, and they've given a statement of intent of that. And actually, you asked about the gearing, so with this injection of funds, it's just dropped to 77.4, so it's coming down. I have to just get this in there, Chairman, that it was actually under the Labour Party in the sort of mid-2000s that this debt, if you look at a graph, started to go like this in the water companies. And it's stabilised under this government.
I think what we've been talking about today is the difference between raising debt to pay dividends and raising debt to invest in infrastructure, which are two completely different things.
Yeah, well, I think you've had a lot of discussion and answers about that and about you know, where the money goes. But equally, Thames haven't paid what they call dividends for 6 years, but they completely admit, and is in their accounts, the shareholders haven't been paid the dividends, but the money has gone to that service holding committee. And I'll bring David in here if you want more detail on that.
I think the question I was going to ask, maybe David could come in if necessary. You know, are you prepared for potential failure? And if so, could you reassure the committee and indeed the taxpayers that this wouldn't be about bailing out the shareholders, but about ensuring that service continues to be supplied?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a really clear message we have to give customers. This will not affect customers. The whole point, if it was ever needed, would be, and it's not a form of renationalisation, just to get that absolutely on the record, it's a tool that's used to ensure that the services can continue and that new owners can be found. Bulb has been referred to a number of times in the work with Desnes. So, lessons can be learned from that. Obviously, water companies are different in the way they're structured, but we can give absolute assurances that if necessary, the system is there, but also I'd really like to assure the committee that we will keep the committee informed as and when and if necessary. But as I said in speaking to the chairman yesterday, we would be, it's not on the cards. We're a long way from that. There's a lot of work underway already with Thames to sort the gearing out and to ensure that the company can continue to deliver the services customers need.
Okay. Did you want to come in?
Just add a little to that, Chair. So, as the Minister said, should a special administration order ever be needed for a water company, the statutory purpose of the order would be to ensure that customers continue to receive their water and their wastewater services, and that public interest test is really the reason we have a special administration regime on the statute book in the 1991 Water Industry Act. As I think David Black was saying earlier, in terms of taxpayer liabilities, important to note that this is a company, in the case of Thames, with £19 billion worth of assets. So in the first instance, the task of the administrator, if appointed, would be to work with debt holders and the company to protect the interests of the taxpayer. On your question about preparedness, obviously we need to keep all of our preparations for a whole range of scenarios up to date, and that's what we will do. But as I think Sir Adrian indicated earlier, the liquidity statement from the company was important, because I think that's the company very clearly signalling that with £4.4 billion of liquidity, we're some way off some of these more scenarios.
Okay, thank you. Julian Sturdy.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Minister, I just wanted to touch on worst case scenarios. So you've already mentioned that we're some way off this, which is good news. But if it was a worst case scenario, how advanced are plans to potentially nationalise Thames Water, and have you estimated any costs of doing that?
Well, I'll reiterate, we're nowhere near that. And what we don't want to do is scare people. This is being closely monitored by Thames. They're working incredibly closely with Ofwat to steer through this. And also, it's not nationalisation. I think you said that. And government has the process. It has the powers if they're needed. And won't hesitate to use them, of course. And so I think, I need to give assurances that is what would happen. We've got, and what would, government, the Secretary of State and Ofwat have the powers to place the company in special administration effectively. And the point of it would be that so that it could be transferred as a going concern to new owners. And either on insolvency grounds because they're unable to pay their debts, or the other way it would happen would be if it was on enforcement grounds, if they were in serious breach of one of their duties.
And I understand all that, and I understand that I'm talking about a worst case scenario here, but it's just really what planning has been done if this scenario does come up, and also what ability is it would it be to pass it on to another buyer, basically? And have you looked at those options going forward? And I suppose also, what conversations have you had with Treasury about this as well?
I'll bring David in here.
Shall I take that? So, as I say, we keep all our preparations up to date for a range of scenarios, up to and including special administration, should that ever be required. As I say, it doesn't look imminent at this point in time, as I think both the company and the regulator said earlier. We would do all of that work jointly with the Treasury and indeed with UKGI as well. And so should it be required, we would be prepared for that. That said, the company has just signed off its accounts and it's returned its various statements to Ofwat, giving assurance, the judgment of the directors that it's a going concern, independently validated by the auditors. The focus now is on the company's business plan. That's the critical thing that the regulators need to see, is the company bring forward its business plan. I think you heard Sir Adrian Montague talking about this earlier. The company does need to prioritise as part of its business plan. There are performance issues the company needs to address, and that's the thing I think our principal focus is on for the foreseeable.
Okay, but I still haven't really, you still haven't given me the confidence that in this worst case scenario that those plans are there in the background ready to go. Can you confirm that?
We keep all of our preparations up to date, up to and including preparations for a special administration order should we ever need to apply to the court for one.
Okay, thank you. Last point, if I can, Chair, very quickly. In some of the previous discussion, Thames Water, it was discussed about Thames Water having an immediate payoff of around 560 million of their debt in case of a nationalisation. Now, they say they don't recognise that clause. Could you shed any light on that at all?
We saw that earlier exchange. I'm afraid we didn't recognise the figure either. So we will do a bit of, we'll check in with the regulator and indeed with the company after this committee. And I think the committee committed to write on that point. The company committed to write on that point.
Yeah, could you share that information with us when you, when you get it?
Course.
Thank you.
Happy to.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Ian Byrne.
Thanks, Chair. Minister, England and Wales are international outliers on the level of water industry privatisation since 1989. Privatisation since 1989 to give us £72 billion gone to shareholders. Water companies have built up a debt mountain of 60 billion, used this to finance dividends to shareholders. Our bills have gone up 40% in real time terms since privatisation. The Environmental Agency has said by 2050 some rivers will see 50 to 80% less water during the summer months because of the climate disaster. Water companies are now actually leaking away 2.4 billion litres of water every day. Every day the water companies discharge raw sewage into our rivers and seas, over 9 million hours since 2016, and we know the consequences of that. Catastrophically, 14% of English rivers are considered to have good ecological status. Not one reservoir has been built since 1989, and nearly 70% of the British public want water back into public ownership. So, would you not agree with the vast majority of the British public that the experiment of privatisation has certainly not served the best interest of this country at large?
Thank you for your list, sir. I just want to put something on the record, Chair. Actually, if you take inflation into account, since 2020, our water bills have been pretty static.
2020?
That's 2010, sorry, 2010.
1989.
So from 2010 to 11, it was £427 on average. And 2020 to 21, it would be £426. So I think we have to look at that in perspective. And take inflation into account. So I think your main question was about privatisation, though.
Yes.
And I would reiterate that, and actually, England is relatively unusual in terms of its privatisation model compared to other countries. But actually, the UK invests more per inhabitant than most of our comparable countries. And that does include Germany and France. And actually, we've had increased levels of investment since privatisation, as I said at the beginning, which has resulted
Minister, why
in
do
a lot of benefits.
Why do 70% of the country who are both, and this isn't ideological, this is a lot of Conservative voters in the same mindset. Why are they so unhappy with the current system? Why do they want it to bring back into public ownership?
In terms of any, errors that water companies have made, I've made it absolutely clear many, many times, standing at the dispatch box, that they need to be held to account. For example, whether it's the use of their storm sewage overflows way above what their permits allow. That's why we brought in the storm sewage overflow reduction plan. That's why we've asked every single company to produce a plan for all of their the relevant storm sewage overflows. They are now with our department. They have already come in. But I think, you know, it has to be said, since privatisation, we've attracted 190 billion pounds. That's about 5 billion a year, which arguably would have been very, very
hard to get. Why have you got such record levels of dissatisfaction? Why are so many people so angry about what's happening in their communities?
We want satisfaction as well, don't we? And I think we also, and I would be the first to say, water companies have to get their house in order, and that's why we're coming down so hard on them, but also why we have put so much in the Environment Act, why we've got our integrated plan for water, why we had our storm sewage overflows reduction plan, and why we've got all our targets that they're going to have to deliver on. But I think we do also have to say that we've had some successes under privatisation. Leakage has been cut by a third. Outages have been cut by a fifth. And I'm not defending any of the recent outages we've had from some water companies. They have to get their house in order, and they are. And that's what Ofwat has to do, and that's what we have to oversee. And I think we have to demonstrate to the public that a lot of good is being done for water, and water is the most critical thing going forward. That's why we brought out our integrated plan for water, and why, as a government, we're backing it all up with legislation and indeed enforcement and higher penalties and so forth.
Maybe we have to take the ideological straitjacket off and look at alternative models of ownership, because many would say it's been a catastrophic decision to leave a public good at the mercy of the market, something which actually sustains life. So we looked at alternative models of ownership and governance, such as those in the Welsh, Scottish and Northern Irish waters.
Well, obviously it's really sensible to learn from other people, but in terms of Scotland, I think David will back me up here. So in England, we're now monitoring, and it's this government that's brought in all the monitoring. That's why we really know what's happening. This happened under the Conservative government, not the previous Labour government. I think it was 4% of storm sewage overflows monitoring when we took over. Now it's 93%, and it will be 100% by the end of the year. Now in Scotland, they actually only monitor 4% of their storm sewage overflows. And in Wales, I believe I'm right, and we can send you the stats, Chair, their illegal use, basically, of storm sewage overflows is much higher than it is in England. I think, David, you might be able to back me up with some of those stats.
We're in danger of straying into quite an ideological debate, which, you know, this particularly looking at the issue of Thames Water, the problems they face at the moment. So I understand that. I think probably the next general election will be a good opportunity to exercise these issues, Ian. So, okay, so can we move on to Derek Thomas?
Thank you very much. So actually, I'm sadly picking up from that, and you're right about the monitoring. The reason people might be dissatisfied is because actually we have provided some very transparent information about what's actually going on and then how we fix it. I completely get that we've engaged with the consumers, customers told them what is expected, and that's why they're much more aware of what's going on. But the concern I've got is that much of the water industry is owned by overseas financial investors. I wonder if you think, with that responsibility in your portfolio, whether actually that's an acceptable thing to have for the UK customer, and whether there should be stricter ownership criteria.
Yes, thank you for that. And yes, we do have a lot of overseas investment, but I think in a way that's one of the strengths of the system. Despite all of the conversations that have been going on, we've still continued to attract a great deal of overseas investment, and we need to attract in overseas investment so that we've got the funding that we require. Obviously, a strict eye needs to be kept on that and where it is coming from. But we do actually, just to give reassurances, we do have a power to intervene in investments through the National Security Investment Act, and indeed we would have the power to block an investment if it was deemed necessary. David might want to add to that.
That's certainly true on national security grounds under the Act. It'll be familiar to Mr. Jones. I think the other point to make in terms of foreign investment is there's no differentiation in terms of Ofwat's ability to regulate and take enforcement action, whether the investor is a domestic investor or an overseas investor. So Ofwat will regulate, as it were, sort of blind to the provenance of the investment, and will go through a process of testing in dialogue with prospective investors any acquisitions.
Yeah, thanks. So we heard a lot, I don't know how much you caught of the role of Macquarie earlier on in the session. And given the issues caused by Macquarie's ownership of Thames Water, should we have concerns about the ownership of Southern Water and other essential infrastructure, such as gas distribution infrastructure in the UK by that company?
Yes, I did. I overheard a bit of it. We were just waiting outside the door at that bit. But you know, I suppose we, you know, I would reiterate that we are still continuing to attract this overseas capital, which we really need, and we do have the powers, you know, to intervene if necessary, and there's been very close oversight of Macquarie and its involvement with Southern. Southern itself, you know, it's actually doing the sort of self-monitoring it actually needs to do. It's just put a stop on paying out any dividends as a result of one of the recent credit ratings. That didn't come from Ofwat, that didn't come from us. You know, their board did that themselves. And you know, if there were concerns, this is why Ofwat have got this very clear oversight, why they've really ramped up their monitoring and their assessments of financial resilience, and why we put new powers in the Environment Act, you know, which they wanted, so that they can change licences. And in fact, what happened with that changeover at Southern, of course, was there was an opportunity with a new company coming in to change the licence, so that they can get these resilience measures firmly embedded. And for example, you know, dividends now cannot be paid if there's any issue about financial, the credit rating or environmental performance. And in fact, that all backs up what we said to Ofwat in our strategic policy statements, which we give to Ofwat, and they have to act in accordance with it.
If I may just sort of briefly build on that answer, I mean, I think the important change that the Environment Act brought in is that whilst previously Ofwat could vary licence conditions, it had to be done with the agreement of the company, and what the Act does is it strengthens it, so Ofwat can now impose licence conditions on the company. And two other sort of first uses of those powers are, one, as I think Ofwat were explaining earlier, preventing money flowing out of the regulated company in circumstances where the credit rating of the regulated company is reduced, and two, much more explicit enforcement of a linkage between dividend payment and performance. And so that is a distinct shift with more legal backing for Ofwat compared to when Macquarie first entered the sector.
And also, Treasury have just agreed that Ofwat have basically got another £11.3 million for enforcement. So that's going to go on more monitoring, more reporting. This, you know, much more forensic oversight.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I'll leave it there because I'm conscious of time.
Thank you very much. I think your office indicated you need to be away at 12:30, but if you're not catching a train, could we prevail upon you for a little bit longer?
Oh, that would mean I'll be staying
11, sorry, 11. Sorry, 11. Can we prevail upon you for a little bit?
We'll do our best, Chair.
If short answers would probably help in that regard as well. Darren.
Just a short question for me on that basis. The UK is about to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, where companies from those member countries can sue the British government in a private interstate dispute settlement scheme for loss of expected earnings because of the actions of the British government. Canada and Australia are both members of CPTPP. If we end up in an environment where the government has to take action on Thames Water, for example, and the Canadian shareholder loses out, could they bring action against the British government to recover that amount? And has that legal risk assessment been done as part of your planning?
Well, I think I should take it away and give you a fuller response. But of course, the decision to enter an administration rests with the court. So the government, the Secretary of State, or Ofwat with the consent of the Secretary of State would apply to the court. So in those circumstances, it would be the court making administration order. So I will talk to my lawyers, but in effect, they would be seeking to bring action against a court order.
You could write to us with your assessment, that would be helpful.
Happy to.
I don't know the answer, which is why I'm asking.
Yes, I think some lawyers could get quite rich on this particular point. Barry had a very good point before.
Just following up on the issue of foreign investors. Yesterday, the Deputy Prime Minister identified China as the top security concern. Now, you have said today that it's a good thing that we have foreign investors in Thames Water, but of course the Chinese Investment Corporation owns 8.7% of that. Do you think that that's a good thing, or is it something that the Deputy Prime Minister should be concerned about?
I'll just refer you back to my previous answer. If there were any concerns, there are powers to intervene, to block investment, and we do have the National Security Investment Act, and we, could act accordingly with that. So unless David wants to say any more, I think I'll leave it at that.
I don't think there's any more we can say here about that.
No.
Thank you. Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Chair. Today we've been looking at the example of Thames Water, but also as its broader implications for the resilience of the water sector across the country. Now, the government has said that through what's going on with Thames, there is no risk of water bills going up. But given that huge infrastructure investment is required, do you feel that position can hold? Can you reassure the public that bills will not be affected?
Well, as he will know, bills are capped until 2025 anyway. There's no expectation that bills will be rising in the short term. They actually are subject to inflation. That's completely separate from what's happening to the water companies. But in terms of any potential rises to bills, that will all come out in the wash once Ofwat have gone through all of the business plans for the water companies. So, and you know how they work. They look at what water companies are required to deliver, what expectations we as a government have put on them through our targets and through the public's expectations. In fairness, the huge investment that will have to happen in future, and then. Decisions will be made, but I would really add that we're always mindful of the effect on consumers. We do have a sound system for looking after the vulnerable, and we have our water shore system. I think already 1.3 million people have been helped through that. So that is always there, our social tariffs, payment holidays and so forth, and will continue to be there. And indeed, we will considerations will be made about whether there might be some impact on customer bills, but we can't say what that will be yet.
Broadly, you feel that hopefully the 5-yearly water bill review, these events shouldn't buffet them too significantly.
Well, also, the whole reason why we have the debt and the equity, of course, is to get the big cash injection in to build the infrastructure as fast as we can within the limits of, have we got the people available to build the stuff in particular, have we got the materials, but also so you don't get sudden impacts on bill payers, and it's always got to be smoothed out. I think it wouldn't be wrong to say that, of course, Thames Tideway Tunnel, that has been factored into bills. That was all completely understood by the people of London, and that's due to open next year. And that's the way that's worked. And that's a completely separate private partnership, private-public partnership.
And separate to that, the government has announced very welcome that there will be potentially unlimited fines on water companies that don't play according to the rules and not fulfilling their capabilities. Can you give reassurances that if those fines are enacted, and we welcome that those teeth are now being given to the regulators and the enforcing agencies, can you give reassurance to the public that that will not have any effect on water bills?
Or the fines?
If we...
No, well, the fines have got to come out of, from shareholders, and no money should ever come from customers to pay for these fines.
They should have no effect on customers' bills then?
And, we've also set up our water restoration fund so that money from fines go into that. That money will go back into the environment. And, I think you are referring to our announcement that we've just made about the variable monetary penalties. Shall I talk about that now, Chair?
If you want to briefly give it a plug, I thought it was
it's very exciting.
Coincidentally, it was announced just before this.
Well, Chair, that we've been working on this, and indeed, the Right Honourable Philip Dunn has worked very hard on this particular issue, as have many others, to see if we could, the current limits, on the cap for civil penalties is £250,000. Today we've announced that will be unlimited, and that's for people contravening their permits, and it's will be used as and when appropriate. But there will still be obviously criminal opportunity to go to the criminal court, but if appropriate, these civil penalties can be used.
Thank you. I think Alan wanted to come in briefly on the back of that question.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I should say I work for Scottish Water, so just to put that on record, the Minister referred to Scottish Water and about private investment being the way forward, but it's worth pointing out Scottish Water has invested 35% more per head on average since privatisation compared to England, and the bills are lower, so the investment can be done through the public body. But just to ask the Minister, do you believe in the polluter pays principle?
The polluter pays principle?
Yes.
Yeah, and I think I would take issue potentially on some of the Scottish stats, so I think, Chair, we'd need to just look at those, because I did give the stat about the...
I'm quite confident on these, but so if we move on, I'm very confident on these, but if we move on the polluter pays principle, in England and Wales, there's still a right to connect of housing developers. Last year, something like 200,000 houses were built in England and Wales connected to the sewer system. If they cause any overloading of the sewer system, cause any additional overflow discharges, then it falls on the water companies and the bill payers to upgrade the sewers. So in effect, that's the opposite of the polluter pays principle. Water bill payers in England and Wales are paying a subsidy to housing developers, because normal practice would be the housing developers have to pay for upgrades for the sewer before the houses are constructed. So why is the government not changing that?
I would refer him to our integrated plan for water, where we cover this specifically in terms that all new houses have to have separate connections, and I would also refer him to the work we're doing with the DULUC department and the housing industry to separate out these systems.
It's not law yet, is that correct? It's not into practice yet?
Many new developments already do it, but going forward, mandatory. This will be what will happen.
A new housing developer can come along, connect 5,000 houses to the sewer, and it's not mandatory to do sustainable urban drainage, and it's not mandatory for them to do the sewer upgrades. When?
It will be, and we will give you chapter and verse, Chairman, to go into the detail.
Until then, the bill payers are subsidising housing developers, isn't that the case?
No, I've answered the question. This is being addressed. We got hundreds of thousands of Victorian houses in this country, and that's one of the problems. That's why we have storm sewage overflows, is because of this system, and that they had to be an extra emergency fail-safe measure. We're addressing all this now,
and you're allowing them to be overloaded by new houses being connected without doing.
I think we probably need to move on. Of course, it's the existing housing stock that causes the problem with stormwater outflows. New housing has separate top waters, so
exactly
reduces sewage, but it doesn't inundate the system.
Right. We're also putting in sustainable urban drainage, which will also address the problem he is addressing.
Last question, Philip.
Thank you, Chairman. So just following up Neil Hudson's comments about the regulator and the licensing regime, we heard from Ofwat earlier that they are part of the they are investigating Thames Water permit breaches alongside the Environment Agency, over 2,000 of them. That was something that was initiated in response to a report from the Environmental Audit Committee on the one hand and the new Office of Environmental Protection focused on water issues. It was not stimulated by their own action and recognition of problems. Do you believe that the powers that they've now got, that you've just been referring to, and the extra resource you've just been referring to, will allow the Environment Agency and Ofwat to do their job properly and investigate permit breaches as a matter of routine course rather than prompted to do so by parliamentary and other interaction?
Well, obviously, we want them to be fully functioning, enforcing. We want clean water. I've said all the way along the line that, sewage in rivers is unacceptable. Some of the stats we've had for water companies are unacceptable, and that's why we've been tightening step by step the regulator's powers. Why we brought forward those measures in the Environment Act, which will enable licences to be much more altered, so that dividends cannot be paid out if there's any environmental damage or if there's a financial issue with the credit rating. But it's also why Ofwat have now got this extra 11.3 million on the enforcement. It's why we've introduced these variable monetary penalties that are uncapped. And it's also, in fairness, it's because of the monitoring we're doing as a government that all of this has actually come to light. I know that the EAC did a lot of really useful work, if I'm honest, and this committee in helping gather the evidence for lots of these things. But it's the monitoring that's bringing it all to light. And it was actually our monitoring that showed that lots of these water companies were breaching their permits, and actually some of them, they did put their hands up and say, we admit we are using our storm sewage overflows too much. And that's true, then. We've got this huge investigation that's been underway, and we're wading through all of those, and people will be held to account, if they are responsible.
So the outcomes from those investigations will be subject to this now new, as you just said, uncapped fining regime. Is that right?
People with permits, that comes under the permitting regime. But they could. There are two courses: the civil penalties, which will be quicker to operate, but there is still the recourse to go to the court.
If I might.
Yeah, David.
The EA investigation into potential permit breaches at wastewater treatment works is a criminal investigation, so wouldn't be subject to today's announcement, which is essentially giving them more tools in relation to civil sanctions. Yeah. But for the most egregious cases, there's still the criminal route, and that's the route they've gone down for this one.
The civil sanction can be applied for by the Environment Agency and Ofwat, or just the Environment Agency?
These are Environment Agency and Natural Inland powers. So it's powers for the environmental regulators. And that
would apply, for example, where a campaign group identified a problem, drew it to the attention of either Natural Inland or the Environment Agency, and then instead of being treated as a routine expense of doing business, which is how water companies have been operating, there will be a scale of fines. Are you providing advice on the level of fine for the level of severity of problem, or is that going to be up to the EA?
You've highlighted a very good point in that the system was slow, before, if you had to go to court. Obviously, it's all based on evidence that, whichever method you use. But this could be more flexible and quicker, providing you've got the evidence to actually hold someone to account, so that the police does pay. And obviously, there will be guidance on these tools.
So just 2 points, if I may, just to supplement that. One is there are Sentencing Council guidelines as a reference point for the Environment Agency, or indeed any other environmental regulator. And then just on a point of clarification, the cap lifted today doesn't just relate to water companies, it relates to any operator within scope of the environmental permitting regulations. So actually waste and other potential sort of malpractice could be caught by that.
Excellent. Final question, if I may, Chairman. So the Water Restoration Fund, which I welcome without reservation, I think is an excellent way of ensuring that some of the issues that Alan was raising, that the funds raised from fines does go into resolving the issues, not necessarily the immediate issue, but improving water quality in the area. Can you give us any more indication of how that will work? And does that presumably only applies in relation to fines from arising out of water pollution?
Yeah. The criteria, being worked on now about exactly, what would be most helpful for the water, this fund to go into. But obviously, it's going to improving the environment. And we've got a big emphasis on catchments now through everything we're doing through the integrated plan for water, and because really we need to work at a catchment level if we're really going to you know, have the cleanest, most wonderful water and ecologically healthy rivers. We need to work right the way up the catchment. So there'll be a focus on it going into things like catchment restoration. And there are already some great projects, Chair, but you know, many more of those. This would be a good use for the money.
Determined by DEFRA.
But there will be other categories that are being looked at right now to make sure that the money is channeled to the most useful place to have the quickest impact as well, and potentially to be used in the area where it was raised, where the money came from.
Sorry, I said it was the last question, so it's supplementary to the last question. So, will there be some guidance coming out of DEFRA as to how these will be deployed?
There will, yes. And we've actually sought lots of views on this. So we've been talking to lots of different organisations and groups about where they think the best use of the money would be.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I think we'll draw stumps now, if we may. Could I thank Mr Hill and Minister for your time? Could I also thank our colleagues from the Business and Energy Committee and the Environmental Audit Select Committee for their cameo roles this morning. And order.
Has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.